Hi, my name is Egon Willegagen. I'm an assistant professor at Maastricht University. In this presentation I'm going to tell you a bit about how we have been using linked open data in our research. In particular, most relevant for this meeting, towards the biological plausibility behind the effects that we see after exposure of chemicals. The interesting thing that is happening here when you compare this to research of earlier is that the questions, scientific questions that we have, the biological questions that we have, cover an enormous amount of complexity, particularly when you compare this to old literature. This paper, for example, from 48 is about the relation of the chemical structure with their physical chemical properties. And at that time you could publish a paper with 50 to 100 compounds in a series and a very basic linear regression, as you can see here just below the title of this slide. However, when we look at the things that we're interested right now when doing risk assessment, when we're trying to understand the biological effects of exposure of chemicals, then the question is a lot more complex. There are a lot more things that are relevant. Where does the chemical come from? How does it distribute over an organism, over the body? How does it enter a cell? Does it show cell entry? What is the stability of the chemical, of the nanomaterial? And so one of the approaches that we have been using is at first outcome pathways, which we'll see more about in this session later. And then other things are quite interesting as well. For example, what is the molecular initiating event? Where does the effects, the adverse outcomes, where does that start? And that is where the plausibility comes in. Can we know for sure that some key event leads to another key event, etc.? A lot of information that we need to get together, and one of the solutions that we have for this knowledge integration is semantic web approaches, semantic integration of knowledge and data. And that distinction is very important because we really want to link experimental data with knowledge from past research. And central to this semantic web approach is the linked data network, or linked open data. And this is a depiction of the linked open data cloud with a lot of different resources. And in reddish, light reddish, we have the life sciences corner of this network. All sorts of life sciences databases giving us information that can help us understand the plausibility. When we look at chemistry, also earlier, some 10 years ago, we already worked on this linked open data here for drug data, and not the dark gray ones are the ones looked at in this paper, though not every one of these are actually as open as we want it to be. For linked data for nanosafety, more recently we published a paper of what such a linked data network would look like and what are the information sources that we need to answer the questions that we saw earlier. Now, over the years, I've been involved in a number of projects where knowledge and data is made available as linked open data. For example, we worked on the Campbell database, which explains the interaction of small compounds with proteins, for example. PubChem has a linked data version as well, the PubChem RDF. We've been looking at wiki pathways and making that available as semantic web technology, work driven by Andra Waagmeester in our group. And more recently, Marvin Martes, a speaker later in the session, has been looking into integrating knowledge and information from the AOP wiki in this format. Now, when we look at this linked data, there are a lot of different components or ingredients that are of interest, and I'm going to go through some of them. Semantic web is a stack of different technologies, and one of the most promising ingredients at this moment, I think, is the resource description framework. This was originally based on on XML, the extensible markup language, but nowadays you can use the resource description framework in different serialization formats as well, including Turtle and even JSON. So you can work with resource description framework approaches in a various number of different environments. Central to the RDF is the concept of a triple, and I'll show on the next slide a bit what a triple looks like, but it's very basic bit of data model that you can use to represent information. But in RDF itself, there is no meaning. This is actually a different component, and here we have ontologies or a simple knowledge organization system that help us describe what we're actually representing in the RDF framework. Other components that are important to using this technology are things like Sparkle, which is the query language that we can use, not the only language, but a very common one, or things like SHACs, which is for shape expressions, which help us describe what information needs to be there in the RDF for it to be useful. Now the triple actually consists of three things. The try tree is clear, and here we have two examples of several triples. The first one about the data set, and that one has 5 triples. The first one is that the data set is a data set as specified by the void ontology. It has a doubling core title predicate, so the second line is the second triple, and so forth. There's also at the bottom part an example of what such a triple representation, what an RDF representation for a nanomaterial might look like. And we link it here even using ontologies like the nanoparticle ontology and the OBO ontology to information about physical chemical properties, for example. When it comes to the ontologies, we actually have the web ontology language, which is very convenient because the web ontology language is also expressed in RDF, so we can actually access this information in an integrated way, something that we will see earlier. Some of the ontologies we have been working on are the eNanoMapper ontology for nanosafety data and the chemical information ontology for describing the chemistry of compounds, small compounds or nanomaterials. The Sparkle query language is very nice way to integrate different information from different resources. Here, for example, between wiki pathways and Nextprot, asking about the cellular location of proteins found in biological pathways and wiki pathways. I do like to stress, however, that RDF is just one representation. If you have the semantics described in enough detail, you can go back and forth between other formats. For example, on the left side, nicely shown by a team of Nick Koshev and others for the interoperability with spreadsheets. Your spreadsheets can contain semantic information as well. You just organize it in a slightly different way, and it probably is a bit harder, I think, to enforce. You don't have shape expressions for spreadsheets, something like that. The other thing is that you can easily wrap around application programming interfaces, as shown in the paper on the right, where we use this approach in the OpenFacts project. In this case, an API for accessing the biological pathway information in wiki pathways. So, to get to some of the use cases of why and how we have been using the RDF platform and the technologies around that, and for that I'd like you to think about this example from the nanosafety field. We have a metal oxide, and this metal oxide, we want to know if it shows a form of nanotoxicity. However, metal oxide, as you might realize, there are quite a few different number of metal oxides. It's a class of chemicals, not a specific chemical. So we don't just want to know about titanium dioxide, but zinc oxide and all the other oxides. We want to know if there is genotoxicity data for that. The data at the same time actually is experimental data, and you actually measure that with a biological assay. And there are multiple assays for those as well. So what we need here is actually the ontology part of it. We need some system, some representation that tells us what are all the metal oxides and what are all the genotoxicity assays. And for that we need two ingredients. So first of all, we need identifiers. We need identifiers all over the place, but here too. So we have two identifiers from the nanoparticle ontology and the bioassay ontology for these two terms. And then we can use the hierarchy in these ontology to actually do that expansion. We can expand metal oxide nanoparticle to all the various metal oxides particles known in some resource or known in general. And the same for genotoxicity assays, which we in this case only see one DNA damage assay. But you can replace genotoxicity with, for example, membrane potential assay if you're interested in that, and then you actually already have 5 different ontology terms. Now if we translate this in Sparkle query, we can actually integrate, we can translate this question in blue at the top into an, well, perhaps somewhat elaborate Sparkle query, but that knows about the hierarchy in the ontology and expands the things along the way. Now, this is something actually, this expansion that we're using here for ontologies, we know how to do that. This is something extensively studied in the OpenFacts project, and you can easily do this across datasets, across databases, as long as your representation is precise enough, which is the whole point why we use the semantic web approaches. And the output of a query like this is simple a table again, basically a spreadsheet, and with the difference that each column here has a meaning specified by an ontology as well. So even after we asked the question, after we integrated the information, the semantics continue to be useful. Now, a second example of where we have been using these RDF, these semantic web technologies, is our biological pathway database, Wiki Pathways. And we can see here in red nanoparticles and a number of those molecular initiating events, the first things that happen. And at the same time, we see a lot of downstream effects here. So reactive oxygen species might happen. And in the end, we see a number of different processes like apoptosis, inflammation, proliferation that get affected. Because we have the information here in the semantic format, we can link that to other databases. We do that via our Sparkle endpoint, which we recently showed in the Wiki Pathways paper of this year, or we can use Sparkle to extract information and then represent it in a different way, such as a data set that can be used by the site target linker plugin to Cytoscape. In this case, showing compounds from Campbell that have affinity with one of the targets, the proteins in that network on the right side. And by doing the integration, we can link all sorts of other information, in this case also in blue, disease information. Now, a last project that I want to show here is Wikidata and Scolia. And this is an upcoming resource that we have been using for the life sciences. On the left side, we see an Horizon 2020 grant proposal that we submitted, and we didn't get the grant, but we decided to publish the full grant in the journal Research Ideas of Outcomes, which has an article type for grant proposals. The grant was reviewed, of course, not by the journal, but by the European Commission, and well, technically found suitable, not funded, unfortunately. A number of us went ahead, nevertheless, with one aspect in particular, Scolia, which is a graphical user interface that allows us to visualize knowledge in Wikidata. And this actually was a grant that was awarded not by Horizon 2020 but by the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation. And with this we can do a lot of things, and more recently 2 papers by Andra Waagmeester again, who earlier did the Wiki Pathways RDF, and many others. We've been adding information and making Wikidata a central node in this linked open data cloud that we saw earlier for the life sciences. First last year published in eLife, and earlier this year information about proteins of the coronaviruses. And as said earlier, the representation is one thing. We can query information, we can visualize it in many ways. We can integrate all this information easily in existing workflows. Here, a markdown book on GitHub where queries are run dynamically when this book is converted to HTML. Another example of data that we're adding is that is relevant to toxicology is about the exposome. When we're exposed to chemicals, we want to know where they're from. They might have an origin in plants. So information of integration of screening the metabolites in an exposome experiment, you want to know, remove those that are just coming from plants in the area where you did your experiment. And then a natural product database integrated in Wikidata is very helpful. So are we there yet with biological plausibility? No, probably not. We still have a lot of information to integrate. We can start to answer some of these questions, but not all of them. So the continuous need for fair and open data will continue. And for that, I just as a last note want to mention the data note that we just have introduced in the journal in Cheminformatics, where we deliberately promote people to publish their data just as a data, separate or just isolated, and reward them for making data reuseful. With that, I would like to acknowledge a lot of people here. Each dot is the affiliation of one of the people I've been co-authoring articles with, many of these in the area of this semantic web representation. Thank you very much.